Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Robin Minter-Smyers, a partner at Thompson Hine and the president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker, the Honorable Eric Garcetti, Mayor of Los Angeles. Mr. Garcetti was elected the 42nd Mayor of Los Angeles in 2013. He's the city's first elected Jewish mayor, as well as its youngest, and the second Mexican-American U.S. mayor in over a century. He's the chief executive of a municipal government comprising dozens of city departments, serving 4 million people, and also oversees the nation's largest public utility, the nation's largest airport, and the nation's busiest arrival and destination airport. Mayor Garcetti has received acclaim for initiatives focused on creating opportunity in his city, including raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2020, cutting the city business tax, and providing free tuition for up to 2 years of community college. He's also responsible for the launch of the nation's largest anti-homeless and affordable housing initiatives, and spearheading the passage of the nation's largest local infrastructure plan, the $120 billion Measure M. Considered a leader among his peers, Mayor Garcetti serves as the chair of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Infrastructure Task Force and chair of the Mayor's National Climate Action Agenda, which organized the Climate Mayors, a bipartisan, peer-to-peer network of mayors working to demonstrate leadership on climate change who represent nearly 70 million Americans. This group aims to fill the vacuum arguably created by President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. Rumor also has it that Mayor Garcetti is considering a run for the Democratic nomination for president in 2020. Will he be the first person to go from City Hall? Will he be the first person to go from City Hall to the White House? Perhaps we'll hear more about his plans today. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming to the stage the Honorable Eric Garcetti, Mayor of Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, that was such a great introduction, I should just probably go to questions. But thank you, Robin, for the kind introduction. Thank you to Dan and the entire team for such a warm welcome to the membership of this august club. It is a real honor to be here today with you. You know, the founders of this club were very clear with their intentions, and I quote, "A city club will furnish a meeting place for people of all shades of opinion, political beliefs, and social relations, because accurate information on public questions is a fundamental need in our cities, and a free and open discussion is the most effective way of securing such information." Wow. What a magnificent charter. What powerful words. And what a necessary goal, especially in these times. And it makes sense, as Dan said, that the first forum ever in this club was 3 mayors from Toledo and Cincinnati and Cleveland, who in 1912 came here to talk about the state of the world. So clearly you had the right idea. If you want to get something started, talk to mayors. When you want a new beginning, start locally. Start where people live and work and play and pray and listen. And so I accepted your kind invitation to be here today in that same founding spirit, as a mayor who believes that we need a new beginning in this country today. That's one that is grounded in our local communities and one that's grounded in our local leadership. But I'm also here today as an American, just as Eric Garcetti, an American whose story begins with a young woman whose name is Fanny Shane, who fled the Russian Empire and came with nothing more at 17 years old in her pocket than $20 and the address of her brother in Dayton. She found work as a dressmaker, and she fell in love with a handsome tailor from nearby Columbus named Louis Rothblatt, himself a refugee as well. These were my mother's grandparents, and they got married in Columbus in 1909. So without Ohio, I literally would not be here today. So after a century, on behalf of my family, let me give a deep and abiding, a genuine thank you to the Buckeye State for being the kind of welcoming place that my family could come, find each other, make a living, and flourish. When I think about Fanny, she was from here, she developed her skills, she got a ring, and then she left for LA, kind of like LeBron. I don't know, too soon? Too soon? Too soon, okay. I had to address the elephant in the room. Let me get to the other side of my family then, quickly. My father's father is the most recent immigrant to this country, Salvador, who came here as a 1-year-old, carried in the arms of, as we say in Spanish, my bisabuela, my great-grandmother, who crossed the southern border in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. And then he found his dream in this country, too, to start a family, to volunteer to fight in the Pacific Theater before World War II. He was a dreamer before we used that term. And as a veteran, he got his citizenship, became a barber, and started his dream. And the driving optimism of my ancestors represents everything about America that I love. That the belief they could pick up and go someplace new, this huge unknown land where people spoke a language that was unknown to them, that they could find something meaningful for themselves and for their children. That faith, that belief is America. A great nation that gives people a chance not only to achieve a higher standard of living, but to find something deeper, meaning and purpose in our lives. As Americans, we've faced countless barriers. We've seen challenges, but our shared heritage is always one of forward motion, of momentum, of always getting a little bit closer to our common dreams. But these classic American stories are becoming harder and harder to find. America's place atop our global rankings is in jeopardy. Washington's gridlock is only underscored by how fast the world is moving around it and past it. And for the first time in American history, our generation, or at least the generation of my 6.5-year-old daughter, Maya, can expect to have lower wages than our parents and our grandparents. Now, why does that matter? Because it's fundamentally un-American. Americans who defined the 20th century suddenly feel powerless and isolated in the 21st century. We feel like we're losing our freedoms, we're losing our opportunity, and more than anything else, I think we feel in our hearts we're losing our connection to one another. As debt, soaring healthcare costs, student loans, housing, they rob us of our future. And today, stories of people escaping despair and finding hope in America are being replaced by stories of people dropping out of America into despair and hopelessness with opiate abuse and even suicide. In this warm-hearted state of Ohio, suicide has risen by 36% in the last decade. These are challenging and complex times. The future is coming at us so fast that many of us feel unable to adapt to it. We're filled with anxiety. And yet, paradoxically, this time is also filled with great excitement. I call this combination of anxiety and excitement, anxitement, right? That feeling that the future is so exciting, but we wonder what it will do to us. Technology connects us with FaceTime, gives us one-click, two-day shopping, and radically increases the productivity of our workers. But deep down, we wonder, will that same technology work me out of a job, make my job obsolete? New cures to diseases are allowing us to survive horrible threats to our lives, to protect our children from illnesses, enable us to live longer. And yet too many of us are one catastrophic health emergency away from bankruptcy. This mix of excitement and anxiety, the excitement inspires us as it confuses us. It propels us even as self-doubt, insecurity, and sadness creep into the American soul. I feel this excitement every single day because I'm a local leader. But it inspires me to take action, to turn this great nation around. Indeed, turning things around is in our American DNA. I mean, just look at our Declaration of Independence. Life and liberty are essential, but happiness is the goal. It's what we are about. And the thing is, the same old solutions from either side of the political spectrum, they're not going to secure our future anymore. The toxic culture of Washington isn't going to win that future. The cavalry, it isn't coming from DC. Nor should it. When you think about it, our nation was founded with the idea that concentrated power can never move quickly enough to keep up with the shifting challenges of our times. What makes the American experiment so radical, and to me so beautiful, is that it was built on the principle that each one of us has a role. Our local communities together is what creates this nation. So I come to you today with the perspective of a local American leader from one of those 19,000 local communities that are America. And the pulse of America, it reverberates in those communities, at our dinner tables, at our PTA meetings, on our baseball diamonds. We rekindle the American dream every single time we open a textbook or a new business or even our home to strangers. That last image of opening one's homes is essential to my life. I was lucky enough to marry a Midwesterner, Amy, who grew up in Indiana. Amy grew up without her father around, and her mother worked really, really hard, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, just to put food on the table. Her mom didn't always know how they'd pay the bills, but they always kept their door open to kids who were in even greater need than them. It was a lesson that was burned into my wife's soul. And that generosity modeled a home that provided for children in need. So for more than a decade, Amy and I have been foster parents. It's immensely rewarding work. I don't know if there's any other foster parents in this room, but those of you who have done it know it can be heartbreaking, but it can be the best thing you ever do in your life. Amy was raised in a family of deep faith, but our faith is rooted now in us as a family, us as a country, and in the children who grace our home, and the core belief that hard work and love can heal all wounds. You know, I ran for elected office like so many of my friends here because I thought I had something to offer my neighbors and my country. But my inspiration really comes from my work as a foster parent. I've seen up close that there are too many children who face material hardships of being homeless, of going to bed hungry in our America. But the most important lesson I've learned is that while we all have these material needs, while those kids have material needs, those of you who know about foster children, you can feed them, but they'll still put food under their bed because they're not sure if it's going to be there the next day. What they crave even more than that hunger for food is that hunger for human connection, for love. You know, Washington could learn a lesson or two from that. Fostering drove home to me the reality that we have a deficit in this country right now that's both material and spiritual. Too many of us as Americans don't have enough food, housing, or health care. But equally, too many of us have lost our connection to each other. It's what we hunger for as human beings. We're kept apart by double shifts. We're divided by our politics. We're struggling to make ends meet. And twice as many Americans say they're lonely today as they were a decade ago. Twice as many. Washington used to carry the hope and the faith of us as Americans. But every day it seems that they squander those confidences just a little bit more. And worse, Washington leadership is actually driving us apart. Our leaders in Washington tell us every day they're 2 Americas, right? You know the script. We live in a divided country. You're either in a red state or a blue state. You're either a rural or an urban person. You come from the coastal areas or the heartland. I reject all of that. These divisions exist largely because they've been inflamed by cable TV and talk radio, by political and corporate interests who exploit those divisions for their own personal profit and their political gain. Now, in one way, they may be right. We are a divided country. But I say we are divided into 2 Americas, Washington and then the rest of us. That is the division of today. The rest of us who can't stand a Washington that is increasingly indecent and corrupt. The rest of us who can't stand a Washington that seeks to amplify power for the powerful, further enrich the super rich. The rest of us who can't stand a Washington more interested in creating imaginary problems and then not solving them than doing the hard work of actually solving real problems. It's different in the rest of the country. It's different when you're a mayor. You see, I live where I work. I drink the water that it's my responsibility to keep clean. My daughter and foster children play in the neighborhood that's my responsibility to keep safe. I have to make sure that my family is dependent on the firefighters that I keep equipped. And I eat the food and buy the products that come through the port that I have to make sure it keeps working. There's nobody I can pass the buck to. Complaining and being bitter doesn't fix the traffic. Pointing the finger at another party doesn't actually produce any results. You see, as mayors and as local officials, our jobs are designed so that we have more in common with our constituents than Washington politicians can ever have. We have to get things done. So we know and see every day, I say this to my carpenter brothers over here, Americans work hard, really hard, and we deserve a government that does too. We deserve the same thing that we talked about in our founding documents, where power came to Washington from our local communities, not from Washington to our local communities. Our Declaration of Independence states whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. My friends, it is time for the people of America to institute a new government. It is time for power in our country to come from the people and from the places where we live. This isn't about reclaiming the House. This isn't about new leadership in the White House. Those things are necessary, but they are not enough. We must demand that Washington follows the lead of local communities instead of the other way around. We must demand that our national leaders pay attention to local successes and then spread those victories across our nation. We must demand that our nation is led from the bottom up instead of from the top down. We must flip Washington on its head. Americans can no longer be defined by Washington. Washington must be defined by Americans. Because even on their best day, right now, we can't count on 536 politicians to adapt quickly enough to prepare us for the future. It's not their fault. Well, it's kind of their fault, but it's not completely their fault. And that's at the core of why we're falling behind. Those two Americas, it's an analog Washington versus a digital world. It's a steam engine capital trying to keep up with a rocket-propelled planet. This is what it's all about, and this is why we urgently need change. DC politicians are so busy counting points scored by tweets and counter-tweets that we're ignoring the challenges that we face in our communities. They're letting other countries win the future in a fast-moving world. But while they fight each other in Washington, let me turn the script to all of us that are in the trenches fighting for you. You see, in our communities, our local communities, local governments and individuals are finding solutions to the biggest problems that we face on our own. And if Washington tracks our best efforts and promotes them nationwide, that's a vision of real change. So in the model that I proposed to you today, Washington's job should be to fund and promote and legislate and enable and scale and replicate and tailor. Washington serves as an enabler of our greatness, not the restorer of it. That's a new system. That's a new system that actually works, that works for all of us. A radical federalism, a new localism that starts with us. I saw that vision yesterday in Youngstown with Mayor Tito Brown at the Youngstown Business Incubator, which is reimagining American high-tech manufacturing where steel mill after steel mill have been closed down. I saw it and felt it last night here in Cleveland at the Foundry Boathouse, where young people are training for the Olympic Summer Games that will be in Los Angeles in just 10 years on a river that once burned. Washington can try to distract us. Washington can try to blame us. Washington can try to divide us. But America is alive and well in our local communities. And the American people are ready to lead right now. The contrast is clear. Washington last year finally said they wanted to return some of our tax dollars in the form of a new infrastructure bill for America. They even floated a figure, $200 billion, over the next decade. But then, of course, they have done nothing. Remarkable during these times because it's a truly bipartisan issue. But local communities aren't waiting. Across America, on the same night that we elected a new president, local communities approved $230 billion in infrastructure packages to fund this nation's roads and bridges and dams and rail, to put building tradespeople to work. In Los Angeles, we passed, as was mentioned in my intro, the largest local transit initiative in American history ×2. $120 billion over the next 40 years to rebuild our roads and expressways, to put 15 new rapid transit lines in America's second biggest city. And, oh, by the way, create 787,000 good-paying, middle-class American jobs that cannot be exported. And thanks to that work, we then started a nonprofit with Nan Whaley and others called Accelerator for America that is helping us to do just that in other places. Our first project is to help other local communities pass infrastructure packages as well. Imagine a Washington that worked that way. Imagine a Washington that followed the leadership of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and other building trades, who are training more than 1 million American workers throughout their careers, spending more than $500 million a year on lifelong careers without a single dime from taxpayers. Imagine if Washington replicated the 50-plus local communities who have made community college free. We did that in Los Angeles, and get this, the first year, this past year, we made community college free. We had a 40% increase from our public schools of full-time community college students in our city in 1 year. Imagine if Washington empowered Main Street banks to provide local access to capital to small businesses, instead of only serving national banks that maximize profits by jacking up fees and opening up fake accounts. Imagine a Washington, after years without action, if they finally raised the minimum wage just to even keep up with inflation. In LA, we did that, the largest city in the country to do so. And we'll be adding $1.3 million every working hour back into the households of 674,000 Angelenos, who in turn are spending that money on Main Street. And to all the doubters, the first year that we raised the minimum wage, our unemployment went down 14%. I run the largest port in this nation. Throughput is key. How much cargo can you load and offload, and how fast? And so we've got to keep up with technology. 1 in 9 jobs in my region depends on that port. 1 in 50 jobs in America depends on that port. And so we were tired of waiting for Washington. We just acted on our own. You see, today, America's localities are America's laboratories. Flipping DC on its head means being open to best practices wherever they arise. When we did LA's transit measure that I mentioned, we also reformed our transit agency, creating an office of extraordinary innovation. In the past, we'd tell people how to build things, ask them to bid, and it would cost 50, 60, 100% more. Now we say, we want to get from point A to point B. What's your brilliance? Tell us what ideas you have. Use the private sector to come in and have ideas and then build it for the public, and we still own it. What if we use that approach for our national healthcare solutions? What if every cabinet secretary had an office of extraordinary innovation? What if every congressional committee held hearings promoting the outstanding successes of mayors like South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who fought for his city, cleaned up corruption by promoting transparency? You can go online right now for South Bend and see a copy of every check that they write. Can you even imagine Washington doing that? They should look in their own backyard, where DC Mayor Muriel Bowser is building safer, stronger neighborhoods through unprecedented investments, over $110 million in affordable housing alone, the most per capita in the country. Or Michelle de la Isla, a formerly homeless teen who is now the mayor of Topeka, Kansas, where she has cut homicides by 1/3 and is investing in the streets and the jobs of her backyard. Or in Cincinnati, where we'll be tomorrow, John Cranley brought leaders from all sectors together to negotiate a historic deal to avert a pension crisis. They closed an $862 million funding gap without any cuts to basic services. And I saved the best for last. How about Nan Whaley from Dayton, Ohio, who is here with us today. Nan is leading a nationwide conversation about too many American lives lost. And she implemented the policies that give her cops and her paramedics the miracle drug that can instantly save someone's life when they're overdosing. Step by ingenious step, she is lifting up Dayton, which is now the fastest growing city economy in Ohio. These models work. And local communities know how to get it done. So if you have a Washington that meets the people where they are, then all of this is possible. A nation is not a collection of laws defined by institutions and borders. That's a country. But a nation is a collection of people. And we are part of the American family. That is our nation. I want a Washington that knows and that works for us, that lifts up local communities, that stands for our freedoms, that accelerates our American brilliance, and that unites us, that invites all of us to the table, that celebrates all of our beauty, and that reminds us that we each belong in this country, that we won't leave anyone behind, and that we each have a place in writing the next chapter of American future. I want a Washington that will stop eroding our core freedoms and threatening our institutions. I want a Washington that will stop attacking the First Amendment, so beautifully celebrated in this room. I want a Washington that doesn't talk about law and order. I want a Washington that doesn't talk tough about law and order while defunding local police and making law enforcement public enemy number one. I want a Washington that doesn't roll back clean air rules pioneered by the Nixon administration with such indecency that even the auto companies are against those policies. I want a Washington that will stop writing a prescription for less health care. And I want a Washington whose tax policies work for hard-working Americans. It's not right when, in a very real sense, when a Fortune 500 CEO goes out for dinner, his waitress is actually paying for his steak. I want a Washington that adds solutions to our challenges and that multiplies our successes instead of the politics of today, which is about subtracting our prosperity and dividing our people. There is so much happiness and brilliance waiting to bubble up in this country. I feel it in my bones every day. I see it in my travels across the state and this nation. I spent 12 and a half years as an intelligence officer in the United States Navy in the reserve component. And I was trained by that great military branch to gather information from friendly and unfriendly sources alike. The job taught me how to listen, how to just shelve my own preconceptions and conclusions and just hear. Just this week alone, I put that knowledge to work. On Tuesday, I visited the home of two sisters who had dropped out of school. Their home had caught fire last year and they became homeless. Their mother had a debilitating disease and had to go into hospice care. And so with their two siblings and their father, they're crashing at their uncle's house right now. And they kind of got to the end of their line and decided to drop out of school. I sat with them on their porch in front of their garden and just listened to them. I listened to them about the subjects that they loved and wished they could go back to, the hopes that they had in their life. And in the end, I convinced them to go back to school and drove them to school to fill out the paperwork so that their American dream didn't end right there in some dead-end minimum wage job and no education. You see, in our work, when we hear about a problem, we can't do nothing. Can't just distract my constituents with my social media accounts, though I do ask you to please subscribe to them. I'm running the second largest city in the nation, so I can't claim that a record number of people are streaming over the borders when they're not. I can't claim that millions of people are voting illegally when they're not. I can't pretend climate change doesn't exist when firefighters are dying on the line in the largest fires my state has ever seen. These are things that we see and we feel every day. In response to rising homelessness in my city, under my leadership, the people in my city, as was mentioned, voted not just once but twice to tax themselves, first to shelter people and then to give them the services they need to get well. We're not there yet, but we're on our way. That's my point. We get into the dirt and start working. Because in challenging times, you can't treat Americans as circus, attendees. You can't treat them as victims. I don't see American victims. Every day, I see American heroes. Heroes who don't want to be part of the problem. They want to be the solution. Speaking of heroes, as I conclude, like many of us in this room, I watched a memorial service for a great American hero, John McCain, last weekend. I was so moved, and I remembered how during one of his last statements when he was interviewed, he was asked by the anchor, "How do you hope to be remembered, Senator McCain?" And I quote him, he said, I hope they remember me as somebody who tried to serve our country honorably. I have made mistakes, but I hope my love for America will be weighed favorably against them. We could all use a little bit more humility these days, don't you think? A little more courage, a little more dignity. You see, you only make mistakes when you're out there trying, when you act. And that's why we have to change Washington from the bottom up. This is change that can happen. This is not just possible, it is required of each one of us in this room. This is the future. And for those who would think that it's too ambitious, isn't that the point? When has ambition ever failed this great nation? Was it not how we won world wars? split the atom, reached the moon, connected the world with cell phones and the internet. In the immortal words of the poet, Robert Browning, a man's reach should always exceed his grasp, or what's heaven for? My great-grandmother Fanny, she had a reach that brought her across an ocean to this state, to this country, to live the American dream. And thanks to her reach, I am here before you today, reaching out towards a future that I might not be able to grasp, but that my children and my children's children will. My fellow Americans, that's what we do. That's who we are. And so I leave you with this. Our reach should exceed our grasp, or after all, what is America for? Thank you so much.
Today, we are enjoying a forum with the Honorable Eric Garcetti, Mayor of Los Angeles. For the audience who is listening to us, you just missed a standing ovation here mid-forum. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you who are joining us via our radio broadcast or live stream. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Holding the microphones today are Membership and Customer Service Manager Corey Eisler and Content Coordinator Bliss Davis. May we have the first question, please?
Mayor Lashana Tova.
Hi, thank you, Shana Tova.
Thank you. I remember when John Kennedy ran, people thought that America wouldn't elect a Catholic president. Some thought that America wouldn't elect a Mormon president. What kind of challenges do you think you would have as a Jewish presidential candidate?
You know, it's funny. Sometimes people ask, could a mayor ever be a president? Could a Jew ever be president? A few years ago, could an African American ever be a president? Even more shorter than that, could a reality star ever be president from television? I think, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'll tell you this. I think that Americans no longer care about the rules that they're told, about who can and can't lead. They're hungry right now. They're hungry for something different. I think they're hungry, finally, each time it's trying a new flavor. So this last election was, well, I'll just take a risk. I don't think that risk has paid off very well, personally. And I think people are now looking for some decency and some kindness and some effectiveness again. But I don't think that who you are in this country anymore matters. I think it's what you stand for and where you want to take the nation. So that's my sense, is that America's ready for anybody to be president. We've seen that, both good and bad.
D.C. had passed comprehensive immigration reform a few years ago.
Absolutely. You know, I shared my immigrant story. Besides folks that are Native American, everybody is either an immigrant willingly or unwillingly. Maybe your ancestors came here because they fled, maybe they came here in chains, but we're all from someplace else. And I think we ignore our history when we ignore the beauty of that, the struggle of that. You know, it's one of those cruel things of American history. If you give in the history book, everything seems so easy, right? Page 68, like slavery just ends, as if there was not struggle and death and torture that went into that. Page 85, suddenly women can vote, as if, you know, women always had the vote, and it's not even been 100 years today that women in this country have. And workers begin to have their rights on page 110 and 115. The farm workers begin to organize. And on page 122, segregation in our schools ends. And page 186, suddenly marriage equality is there. But when you're in the midst of that struggle, it moves so slowly, right? Those words are so painfully written and put down. And we forget that sometimes. With immigration, it's the same thing. I come from a city, a great American city, that really reflects the face of the world today. And I think the face of America tomorrow. We have 39, I think, countries that have their largest population outside their home country. But we also are a huge city of Midwestern immigrants. Long Beach was called the Iowa of the Pacific. We had communities that were settled. Indiana folks went to Pasadena. We know each other, and we know each other because of that great diversity. We need an immigration policy that works, and I'm a little old-fashioned with how I talk about it. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the practical thing to do. I guess I'm too pro-family to try to split families up. I guess I'm too pro-economy to say to immigrant entrepreneurs that in my city, you probably have similar statistics, about 60% of businesses are started by immigrant entrepreneurs on our main streets. And I'm too pro-police and law enforcement to stop listening to police officers over politicians about how best to win trust of the people they police and to make our streets safer. No politician in DC cares about the safety of my family more than I do, or my constituents. So we need a comprehensive immigration policy that helps us get high-skilled workers, that helps us keep growth in our economy, and that takes people out of the shadows. Because there aren't enough people, even if you're the most right-wing person, there aren't enough people to deport everybody who's undocumented here. Let's find a practical solution to raise their wages so we're not competing against them under the table with no worker protections, no benefits, et cetera. Let's come together and solve this as Ronald Reagan did with the Democratic Congress in the 80s and find a solution that works.
Mr. Mayor, thanks for coming to Cleveland.
Yes, of course.
Can you tell us a few more details about the anti-homelessness and affordable housing initiatives in Los
Absolutely.
Angeles? And are they connected? Do they interact with, I'm assuming they do, but
Yeah, absolutely.
tell us a little more. Thanks.
So, you know, different cities have different challenges. Everybody has housing challenges. In some places, housing is very cheap and you need to bring the stock up. In cities like Cleveland, where you've seen population leave and begin to come back. In Los Angeles, we're kind of a victim of our own success. We have such a strong economy and so many jobs that we didn't build enough housing for them. So everybody's been pushed down a layer. Those who used to go maybe into the luxury housing are coming into the middle-class housing. Middle-class folks are going into the working-class housing. Working-class folks are barely hanging on, and those who are barely hanging on are on the streets. Combine those higher rents and higher housing costs with the trauma that America is facing and the lack of leadership nationally, with mental health, with veterans that are coming home from war, kids that are emancipating out of foster care system, sexual and domestic violence survivors. You know, somebody on the street has a unique story, but it's usually a combination lock of many of those elements, not all of them, but many of those. We had a city in which nobody really was responsible for homelessness, which isn't unique. The city used to point to the county, say, well, you got all the hospitals and the mental health counselors and the substance abuse programs and all of that. The county used to point to the city and say, well, you got the cops and you're supposed to clean the streets and you're letting people camp out and all of that. And we decided to just stop that stupid war. Like I said, pointing fingers doesn't solve anything. So we have a housing first philosophy of you need to put people in housing to cure what's ailing them. A doctor once said, and we're spending some of our medical dollars, our money that we get from what we call Medi-Cal, to be able to put people in housing using those dollars we used to spend in hospitals. And the way we got a waiver to justify that with the federal government, the doctor said, if there's somebody who's homeless on the street, who's dealing with bipolar disorder, who has diabetes, and is doing drugs to treat that bipolar disorder because that's all they can do, I need them indoors to treat their diabetes because they're going to hear fewer voices. They're going to maybe stop taking those drugs and we'll get them a proper prescription. We can actually deal with the health thing that may kill them on the streets. We have more people that die in Los Angeles County on the streets who are homeless than we have homicides each year in this America. In Washington, D.C., our capital, per capita, it's even worse than in my city. So that housing first philosophy is to build more housing and then give services to people in that housing. Because you can't just keep them alive on the street, or you can't throw them in an apartment and hope that they're going to get well on their own. And at the same time, build more affordable housing everywhere. And so the way we're doing it is around our transportation investments. That $120 billion I mentioned, we've upzoned to allow developers to come in and build higher, denser, taller, which used to always be what city halls do, and then you have the people against it. We have people telling us that we need to go even higher, a newer generation, millennials and others who are saying, I don't want to be locked out of my own city. We want to have a place we can walk and not have to use a car to get to work, to get to school, to do our things. And so I'm really encouraged that there's a changing of how we're developing our cities to put housing first, because when you have traffic, that's housing. When you have poverty, that's often housing. When you have healthcare that's down, that's often housing. And it's really the prism through which we refract the potential and the challenges in each one of our cities. Thank you. Appreciate it. Are you working in the homeless area too? Right, great. Thank you. Be happy to follow up more.
Good morning, afternoon.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Commend you on your service as a foster parent.
Thank you.
Curious what being a foster parent, how that has informed you as a mayor, particularly with the whole concept of aging out, which a lot of people don't really understand that happens.
Yeah, I don't know what is the law in Ohio 18? So when young people, it's one of the perverse things that we find a child who's been neglected, often gone through terrible either poverty and or abuse or other forms of neglect. And once the system finds them, at least the system tries to, and more often than not, showers a lot of resources towards that person. But then when they turn 18, they are supposed to be an adult. Remember when we all turned 18 and we were supposedly adults? And then says good luck with no social network, often still no family or anything else. In Los Angeles, I'm sure the statistic is similar here, over half of them are either going to be in jail or on the street in the first 3 years. Very few graduate from high school, very few have the life skills. So in California, we raised that to 21. So as long as you're in school, or if you have a child, or you're working, you can have 3 more years of the support from the state, which still, when we're 21, were we really ready for life either. But the point is that I think nationally we need to have that conversation of how we expand that out. Congresswoman Karen Bass, who's my congresswoman in Los Angeles, has started the first kind of foster care caucus, bipartisan. She co-chairs that with a Republican, and has worked on this issue to try to raise awareness. It is one of the most expensive, if you're just a fiscal conservative, forget whether your heart is in foster care, it is one of the most expensive wastes of money in this country. How much money we spend to not get things right. There's already damage done by definition if somebody's going into foster care, but to not right that ship early on is so expensive in criminal justice costs and healthcare costs, et cetera. And then you asked me a very personal question. I spoke a little bit, but I try to not speak anything specifically, obviously, because we safeguard the children who are in our care. But I'll tell you, it's made me just this kind of open and raw person that understands my city in such an immediate way. I got a call last night to deal with something with someone we knew who had been foster care just while we were walking through Western Market and an area in Ohio City. And there's an immediacy to it that we can talk as politicians abstractly about problems, but something like homelessness you understand in the deepest way when you take in a child who is homeless. And before people get scared, I would encourage people to be foster parents. It is no harder than being a parent, right? Which is hard enough. So it's as easy or as difficult as just being a parent. But whether you take in a kid who's, we've taken in kids who are teenagers at the end of their childhood. He's given me permission to speak about it. So our 25-year-old foster son who came to us when he was 17 years old, we're able to help him graduate from high school. He's learning to be a chef in our community college right now. He was never first in his class for anything, but it was his passion. He connected with our free community college and came back last January, and in a 200-question exam, missed only 2 and was the top of his class for the first time in his life. We got to find what makes any young person in this country passionate about and make sure that she has a pathway to get there, that he can find the way, and to make their social network us, not just the system.
Mayor, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Here in Cleveland, recently we've had somewhat troubling indicators related to economic growth, job growth, population growth, or lack thereof. And there was a call to arms, actually, at the very podium next to the bell where you stand right now, a month or 2 ago, to do something about it. Yeah. And there are many, many great minds and great thinkers in Cleveland and tremendous goodwill. But one fundamental issue has been here, and I'm sure elsewhere, but how to pull with one oar, everybody get to the table, and do something about this fundamental large problem. You've had great success in Los Angeles. I'm interested in a free consult from you.
Sure.
If you were dropped down in Cleveland magically and charged with figuring out how to get everybody together to sort of pull with one oar and dispense with egos and so on. Yeah. Big picture, what might you suggest we do?
Well, I'm always careful to do a lot more listening before I give that kind of advice. But let me give you some broad advice, because I've been listening to a lot of mayors around the country, and there is something bubbling up that I think any local community understands and can do. And with Accelerator for America, the nonprofit that I helped found, That's exactly what we're trying to put together, is that playbook, from everything from downtown revitalization to how our opportunity zones, the new legislation that's just passed, going to work. What do we do to get an infrastructure package passed, and what does that mean on the ground? Not a report, not those of us that are doing it, but people in between who can actually be like a special forces team that comes into a city, helps assess, and helps put that plan together. So we're more than happy to work with Cleveland. I see my dear friend Matt Zone here. I'll make the offer to him and his colleagues, to do that here. But the most important thing, and this really hit home for me in Youngstown, is what's your story? What's your narrative? I often talk about my town, that it attracts and grows up some of the best storytellers and story makers in the world. It's where Hollywood is. It's where the narrative art is part of one of these great American industries. And people don't think of politics or city renewal as talking about a narrative, but it's what moves people. When we won the Olympics, that became a point on the horizon. It's just a 17-day sports event, right? 10 years from now. So if I said we're having a 17-day, handball tournament 10 years from now, probably the room wouldn't say, okay, let's all get together and figure out how we can make Cleveland just be amazing then. But if you say handball is one of the events in the Olympics, and we're bringing the Olympics here, it's like meeting your in-laws for the first time and having them over. You're like, oh, I better fix that up at my apartment, put up some art, make it look absolutely gorgeous, or I'm not going to be able to close this deal. And I think Cleveland needs to say who it wants to be, and then get everybody in that process saying it together. Because it's what you communicate to a visitor who's a tourist who can recommend another one come, to an investor who's looking to put her money down someplace and may choose Cleveland but is competing with other cities, and for the person who lives here to say why they should stay in a great town. And I think things follow from that. Core industries, your narrative, embrace your challenges. Many of us are in the hunt for HQ2 of Amazon headquarters. And LA is the only West Coast city in the mix, and there's so many non-disclosure agreements that we've signed that I probably can't even continue speaking. But I'll say this, when we were giving a presentation, one of the things that seemed to capture them was what we were talking about in our greatest challenge, which was solving homelessness. So instead of it being a weakness of saying, look, there are more homeless people living on the streets of Los Angeles than any city in America, we told them what our plan was to fix it and invite them and anybody else to be a part of an amazing turnaround. So I think finding that story is absolutely critical to then the common action. Since the Olympics are coming, 28 projects of those Measure M projects that we talked about are being accelerated, 28 by 28. Other towns around the area are saying, I want to do 8 things by 28. We're finding our cultural institutions saying, oh my gosh, we want a cultural Olympiad. Every year we're going to come together and have great cultural festival, new murals, music, we're going to commission works. It just ignites something in you that is a much bigger force multiplier than just a nice little plan that City Hall develops or a great think tank and then gets shelved. You bet.
Hi, Mayor Garcetti.
Hey.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm studying public policy, leadership, and management at Ohio State's John Glenn College. And my question for you today is, in addition to voting, what would you recommend is the best thing for young people to do who want to get involved in bettering their local communities and also the broader national political environment?
There's a French philosopher, Ernst Renan, who once wrote that the nation is a daily plebiscite. What does that mean? The nation is a daily plebiscite. I think the point was, it's not just about elections every year, 2 years, or 4 years. A nation is defined every day with an act as important, as noble, maybe even more important than even Election Day. And if you're not doing that work in between, you do need to show up on Election Day, but good luck thinking everything's going to change just because you voted. So you have no excuse not to vote, but you have no excuse to stop your activism just after you vote. So for young people, I always tell people who are interested, for instance, in politics, who want to run off to Washington. I know you spent some time there, so don't take that as a criticism. I'm like, why go to Washington first? Go to Washington last. Put your roots down. Get to know a community. Go door to door. I go door to door when I'm not campaigning. And it's the best thing. Like, I'll knock on someone's door. I'll be like, hey, it's the mayor. They're like, BS. Who is it really? They don't say it that kindly, but then they open the door with the screen still there. They're like, you do kind of look like the mayor. I'm like, no, I really am the mayor. So what do you want? What are you campaigning for? I'm nothing. I'm just here to listen to what's going on your street and what I can do to help. And then the door kind of opens slowly, and they look like, what has this guy been smoking, or what's he doing? And then they invite you in, and you sit down for this incredible conversation. You don't have to be an elected official to start those conversations. Get to know a neighborhood. Start working in that neighborhood. The garden that we saw at twilight last night by the West Side Market was so inspiring to me. To meet a Burmese refugee who's become an American citizen just 2 years ago and talk about his first time voting. He didn't start by voting. That's the capstone of him being involved, leading his community. He's from an ethnic group called the Karenni, and he's kind of the head of the Karennis here in the city, about 1,000 people. He's engaged in putting plants into the earth and growing them and harvesting them to feed Clevelanders. He's engaged right there where there's public housing. I mean, to me, that's where the work is. The work up here means nothing if we're not all doing the work down here.
Mayor, hello. Thank you so much for being here in Cleveland at the City Club. A little bit bigger question, bigger picture question. Your ideas and thoughts for domestic policy sound terrific.
Yep.
We have a president who has no background in government, serving in government, and that's concerning. I think we're seeing the effect of it. So I'm interested in knowing your thoughts, concerns, experience in foreign policy.
Yep, thank you. To your first point, I think you're right, and it's not just a criticism of this president. I've watched over the years that people do with politics what they don't do with other industries and other crafts. They kind of assume, oh, I've been successful in my life over here. I can just jump into politics at a very high level. I think people should jump into politics no matter what your background is. But start, like I was just saying, somewhere small and build your way up. I wouldn't come onto a building site and say, I'm the foreman, like as my first job. I want to be carpenter, I'm going to start as a foreman, let alone the contractor who's running the whole thing. I wouldn't go and say, I really want to be a ballet dancer, I'm going to be the principal dancer first before I take a lesson. And yet people think that in politics, it's not a craft. It's not something that you learn. You have to learn how to listen. You have to learn how to legislate. You have to learn how to build coalitions. And to bring people in at high levels, let alone the highest level, who don't understand that, I mean, our current president doesn't understand even the power that he holds, for better or for worse, I think for better some days, of who he can appoint politically and how they can move things through, of what an administration is, of how federal government works. On the international question, it's funny, my background, I thought I was going to go into international affairs. My background is in that, my master's is in that. I studied ethnic conflict and nationalism. I've lived in Burma working with the democratic resistance there when democracy was under attack in Burma. I did international development work in Ethiopia with women who were looking to empower themselves and end terrible medical practices that were in Ethiopia. And I taught international relations, and I thought that's what I was going to go in. As I mentioned, I was in the Navy as an intelligence officer. And then I realized when somebody said, you should run for city council, I'm like, well, I'm really into global. Wait a second. Local is global in any American town, in any American city. To be in charge of Thai Town in Los Angeles, having lived in Thailand, I didn't have to say, tell me about your people. I could say, how are we going to get a park built? What do you want to do for public safety? Running the biggest port in America, I think we understand international trade more than a lot of our leaders in Washington, D.C., who have no idea. Yeah, we want fair trade rules. Hell yeah, we do. But you don't fire a gun first and then hope to have people at the table. You can't be the most powerful person on the playground, even if you're the biggest, and have no other friends and try to take on the other big bullies that are there. I mean, that just doesn't work. That's everything I learned, in life, I learned in kindergarten. And some people miss the lesson, I guess. So I want an America that is great and strong in this world again, and it comes back to its principles. I don't mind when we've had fights over things, like I opposed the war in Iraq. But we know how to argue about those things and still hold the principles. And the rest of the world, even when they've disagreed with us, always agreed that America stood for principles. I haven't heard us defend democracy in this administration, domestically or internationally. That word, I haven't heard it. So when the world says, well, America no longer stands for anything, why should they? And when they don't, and it becomes a world in which it's grab as much as you can, say and do whatever you can, and people have nuclear weapons and jobs depend on international trade flows, and carpenters care what the price of steel is, and farmers do need to sell their soybeans instead of just being subsidized and told it's going to be okay. We need to have an America that stands on its 2 feet and leads by our morality as well as our strength. And I'm very scared we're losing both. You bet. Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum with the Honorable Eric Garcetti, the Mayor of Los Angeles. Today's forum is part of our Urban Leadership Series sponsored by AT&T. We appreciate your support of the City Club programming. Today's forum is the annual David Warshawski Memorial Forum made possible by a generous endowment gift from Florence Warshawski, David's wife. We're delighted to have representatives from 3 generations of the Warshawskis with us today: Lee, Kitty, Tim, Sarah, and Sienna. Thank you for coming. Finally, we welcome guests. At tables hosted by Friends of Nan Whaley, the Fund for Our Economic Future, the Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky Regional Council of Carpenters, and the Metro Health System. We thank all of you for being here today, and that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Mayor Garcetti. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.